Today's session is Getting Your Gray Balance in Check with G7. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Ellie Klutz, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Fiery Wide Format, and John Nate, Senior Educational Architect and Trainer for Fiery Wide Format. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ellie to get us going.
Thank you, Yael. As said, today's session will be all about G7, but also on how to use G7 with your Fiery Pro server or Fiery XF. Now, why all this fuss about G7? Well, let me use Don Hutchinson's words, as he's the inventor of G7 and would know way better what to say. For those of you who have listened to the pre-learning, what I'm going to say now should be very familiar. What John explained on our Connect session a couple of years ago was that G7 is a standardized definition on how to use black and white or grayscale printing and how it should look like. Now, what does that have to do with color? Well, black and white are the backbone of defining color printing. When these are off, it will be very hard to get your color right, if not even impossible. G7 is about lightness, darkness, contrast, gray balance, but I'll let John dig into this during the webinar. The rest is, or the result is a more balanced output for any printing process. So all of this works not just for traditional printing, but also for inkjet printing or cut sheet printing or whatever printing process you would be using. And according to Don, the biggest advantage is the simplicity of this method, and John will definitely run you through the method. So let me hand it over to John, and let's get started with our session, Getting Your Gray Balance in Check with G7. John, all yours.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, y'all, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We've got a big crowd today, which is very, very nice to see. We had a lot of people register for this, so a lot of interest in G7. Hopefully everybody can fit into our virtual room. We've got so many people, but I think we'll make do. After the webinar today, our intention is that you will understand what G7 is and what it does. There's a lot of misunderstanding on what G7 is, especially outside of certain geographic areas. We want you to understand the value of using a set of G7 curves, and that's really what G7 is. It's a set of adjustment curves, really, on your Fiery system, be it a Fiery Pro server or within Fiery XF. We want you to understand that G7 can be used in conjunction with any of the traditional specifications that you might want to use in your printing system, be it one of the specifications from FOGRA or ID Alliance or ISO. It really doesn't matter. We also want you to learn how to take advantage of the entire gamut of your printer. In my opinion, this is probably one of the best features that using the G7 process can give us. It will allow us to use the entire gamut of our output device rather than limiting the output down to one of the specifications from FOGRA, ID Alliance, ISO. We also want you to know how to use the G7 curve with or without Icc profiles. It's possible to use just a calibration file and a set of G7 curves and produce work. That actually is a form of the full gamut printing that I'll talk about. And finally, we want you to understand a little more about the G7 certification options that you might have if you want to take your education even farther than what we'll be covering in today's webinar. But first, let's take a poll. Ellie will post some poll questions here.
So I've opened up a poll.
Okay.
There are 3 questions we'd like you to take a minute or two to go through. These should be fairly quick. If you just scroll down, make sure to get to the 3rd one as well. We'll take a look at the answers from our audience later. And as our participants do that, John, you can continue, and we'll refer back to this at a later time.
Thank you very much. All right, so let's take a look at why did G7 come into being anyway? What was the impetus for Don to come up with this G7 process? Well, he was looking at the traditional printing process. This is traditional ink on, for the most part, offset printing presses. And in the early days of printing, and by the early days I mean not all that long ago, there were all different all the different manufacturers of press inks manufactured press inks with different colorants. You know, they all had their best reason for what they used in their inks. And what we were expected to do was to hit solid ink densities. We would print a 100% cyan, magenta, yellow, and black patch and measure the density. And then we were to measure either a 50 or 60% patch and, again, measure the density. And the assumption was that if our solid ink densities matched, your press and my press, and at the 50 or 60%, that was where we were measuring the dot gain, the amount that the dots grew because the dots were absorbed on the paper and got larger, that we measured that, and if we matched dot gain and if we measured solid ink densities, our presses would match. Unfortunately, because of differences in colorants, we found out that that was not true. Don decided to look at a way to address this and decided to use, rather than densities, LAB values. Now, LAB effectively means what does the color look like. The L channel covers really the density, but the AB channels mean what color is it. And using LAB values to make sure that the color of your ink at the solids as well as the density matched, that was half of the issue. But even just looking at dot gain, that didn't do it either. So he decided that we really need to look at the entire grayscale tonal scale. We need to make sure that from 0 to 100% on our gray scales matched. And once that happened, then we had a very, very, very good chance of having close to matching output. We, in the world of color management, never say the word exact. Well, this is the same problem we have in our inkjets. On our inkjet printers, every manufacturer, again, has different inks. It might be because of different technologies. You know, you might have aqueous inkjet, we have vinyl, we have UV, we have all sorts of different brands, manufacturers of inkjet heads and inkjet printers and ink. And we have the same problem. Our inks have different values. If we match the densities, we're not going to match the look. Traditionally, we use Icc Profiles, and we can use Icc Profiles in conjunction with G7, but today we're going to kind of concentrate on G7. So what exactly is it? And how exactly can it help me? Now, we have had a lot of people that have said in the past, hey, G7, that's what I want you to match. Back when I did a lot of implementations of inkjet rips around the world, I'd, call up people and say, okay, what do we try to match? And sometimes they'd say, oh, Foger 52 or Grackle, but more and more they started saying, I have to hit G7. But that's not a correct statement. Here, let me explain. What is G7 is kind of like, okay, where are you going? You're going to take a trip. Let's imagine you're taking a trip. And where are you going to go? Well, maybe you say, I'm going to New York, I'm going to Paris, I'm going to Tokyo. In the graphic arts world, the question is, what specification are you trying to conform to? What do you want your output to look like? And here the answer might be, it might be Grackle, it might be Foger 52, it might be Japan Color. That's what we want the output to look like. Going back to our geography lesson, how are you going to get there? How are you going to get to New York, Paris, or Tokyo on your vacation? Well, you might say, well, I'm flying, I'm driving, or I'm riding, or somebody's driving me. That's how I'm going to get there. That's the vehicle. If we're looking at our specifications that we're trying to conform to, the answer to how are you getting there would traditionally have been Icc Profiles, but how you're getting there for this discussion is G7. So G7, it's the process, it's the method. It's not in and of itself a target, okay? It's used to help you hit Grackle or Fogra or ISO or Japan or anything else. Just make it easier to get there. In the world of G7, G stands for gray balance. As I said, that's 0 to 100% ramp. We want to make sure that the neutrals are, and I don't want to say gray, oddly enough, but I want to say the appropriate gray or an accurate gray. Because if we are trying to conform to a specification, a grayscale on something, on a press that's running to, say, swap 5, which has a much yellower stock than, say, Fogra 52. Well, the grayscale has to look appropriate for that output method or that specification that we're trying to hit. So we want to hit the correct gray balance, and then the 7 stands for the primary and secondary colors, the cyan, magenta, yellow, black, and red, green, blue, our primary and our overprints. That's what we're trying to control, and it's all based on LAB measurements. The benefits are that it is much easier to control neutrals with the G7 process, because that's really all the G7 process cares about is, for the most part, the neutrals. You know, we're trying to get that gray balance correct. And what we're trying to do is get what we call a shared neutral appearance. That's kind of our fancy schmancy way of saying, you know, a close match, you know, shared neutral appearance. We will likely not get a match. I can't match my swap press to your Fogra 52 press. The capabilities of the output devices are different, especially being impacted by the media. But we can get a shared neutral appearance. I'll cover this in a little more detail in a bit. A faster recalibration, but of the neutrals. Now, a number of years ago, the Printing Industries of America did a survey, and they found that when they tested most consumers were perfectly happy with printed output if the neutrals appeared correct, if the neutrals were gray. The rest of the color was much, much more forgiving. Okay. Remember, most of our consumers don't walk around with their own Pantone book or Toyo or DIC or HKS book to, you know, check and make sure that that patch looks like the right spot color. You know, they're just looking at it for, hey, is this pleasing appearance in most cases? And if the grays are neutral, boy, over 90% of them were satisfied with the output. Even the rest of the color was not all that close. So if we keep our neutrals in check, we really are producing work that most people would be perfectly happy to accept and view and hopefully pay for. So this offers a very fast recalibration of the neutrals, and if that's what we're really caring about is making sure our neutrals are accurate, well, we could get there very, very quickly. And again, enabling full gamut printing. More on that in a bit. But let's take a look at our questions. If you have any questions, please use the question and answer window. We will have time at the end today to answer hopefully all of your questions. And as Yal said, we will send out the printed questions and answers to everyone later. Do we have the poll results?
Yes, we do. Here they are in front of you, so you can see what our audience thought about these questions.
So really kind of this is very interesting. It's across the board, probably a few in each category. Usually we have one category that's the big winner, but people have used it all. Some have used it, some haven't. Anybody that has used it, mostly inkjet printing. Odd that people attending a wide format inkjet printing webinar would be prone to use this for inkjet printing, but oh well, surprises never cease. But a number of people have heard of it but haven't used it, so good. This should be a good educational process for many of you, and hopefully a little, maybe those of you that are G7 experts or G7 masters will hopefully learn something new today. Getting back to the G7 process itself, there are 4 different compliance levels in G7. The first is Grayscale Compliance. All we care about is the grayscale accurate? Is it correct? Okay? It is a process where we are not conforming to a specification. And again, these were all designed, remember, for offset printing. So we're not trying to hit swap or grackle or anything on our offset press or on our inkjet printer. We're not using the correct media. We don't care about the correct media. We don't care about the inks. We don't use Icc profiles. I just want my gray balance correct. The next level up is targeted. This is really what the G7 process was designed for. It is gray balanced. It does conform to a specification. It does use the correct media in the ink because this is ink on a printing press printing to one of the specifications that we use from Fogra, ID Alliance, ISO, or any of the other methods used worldwide. It was intended to make sure that we can get our presses to more easily get to the results that we want. We don't use targeted, by the way, in the inkjet process because of those last two check marks. We don't often have the correct media, and we certainly don't have the correct ink. Okay, we don't have ink that conforms to the specifications for a print. We may get a media. You can get a FOGRA certified media, a Grayscale or a SWAP certified media, et cetera, that you can use. But boy, that ink is just not correct. So that's why targeted is not really in our ballpark, and we're not going to talk about targeted today. Color space is kind of what we've been doing all along. Okay, we are gray balanced. We're conforming to a specification. We use Icc profiles. We certainly don't have the correct ink again on our inkjet printers. Well, we may use the correct media, but often we're doing a simulation. We're using absolute colorimetric, and the G7 color space was kind of the first one that we really looked at in the FireEXF system. If you take a look at FireEXF and we go to the System Manager, and I right-click and I say I want to do a new workflow, and I select one of the proofing templates, notice we have a number of them listed as G7. And the reason they can be called G7, well, the first reason is that Don Hutchinson said I could call them G7, but the reason is that if you measure the Ideal Alliance color bar on your proof and it passes, conforms to, shows that you're in compliance with either SWAP or Grayscale, any of the G7 SWAP or Grayscale setups that we have here, you have to be in G7 compliance. You cannot be out of G7 compliance but still pass SWAP or Grayscale because it's impossible. So that's why we were able to actually list G7 right in our application for the templates, because we are in fact looking to hit this color space compliance level. Now the last is G7 Extreme. This is the G7 Expanded, G7 Extreme. This is the expanded gamut, taking full use of the output device. Again, here, kind of like Grayscale, all we care about is that our grays are balanced. But we want to use the entire gamut, every little bit of color we can squeeze out of that inkjet printer. Now, as I said, we're not going to cover targeted because that's for offset printing presses, but I'm going to start by talking about the Grayscale Compliance. Exactly what does that mean, the Grayscale Compliance? Well, first of all, we want to make sure we have the correct tonality. And tonality is a word, it's a combination of contrast and lightness. It means that from our lights to darks, they are correct. I have the correct number or the correct distance of gradation between 10 and 20% and 70 and 80%. That I don't have all my tones clustered in one area where boy, from 0 to 50, well, it's hardly any change at all. But boy, from 70 to 80, it's a sudden change. That would be a very, very nonlinear output device, and that tonality, that contrast is not correct, okay? So we want to make sure that the contrast and the lightness, how light, how dark, are our grays. The second half is the neutrality. We want to have a neutral gray, or, and I'm going to change this a little bit. These are actually slides courtesy of Don Hutchinson, so thanks, Don, for the use of these. But we may actually color our gray just a little bit if we are trying to conform to one of the specifications later. But if we're in Grayscale, if we're trying to do just gray balanced, then we are looking for neutral grays. And neutral grays measured in LAB color space, A and B are both 0. If you're not familiar with LAB color space, you want to take a look at some of the other color management webinars. We have links at the end of today's presentation. So we're looking for tonality and we're looking for gray balance. And I said earlier this idea of shared neutral appearance. Now here's three different output methods. We've got digital, which might be a toner-based system. We've got inkjet. It could be aqueous. It could be UV. It could be vinyl. It could be any of the technologies you use. And offset. And offset could actually also be a web press. And you'll notice they're all different. Kind of the native output of all of them is different. And if all we do is apply a G7 curve to these, which Don did, we got this. Now, look at the bottom. Are they a perfect match? No, they're not. You might notice more detail in one of the yellow golf balls than another. Maybe a little more contrast in this inkjet than in the offset. The background, the darkest areas are maybe a little darker in some than others. So No, we're not looking for an identical match, but we're looking for the neutrals being accurate and this shared appearance. So that to most people, excuse me, especially the untrained eye, those not in the graphic arts industry, would look at these and go, yeah, they match. When we have to point out what the difference is, it matches. And that's what G7 can do. It's amazing what fixing the grays can do. This is an original image that I think either Don or his son shot. And as you can see, it's ever so slightly blue, okay? Simply applying a set of curves, really a set of G7 curves, you get this. That's all that was done to that image. Just brought it into Photoshop, applied a set of curves, and all of a sudden there is the color. It was all hidden under this heavily blue-biased original image. So fixing grays can just do a world of help to your colors also. Okay, so that's our grayscale. Color space. Color space is, in our world, the traditional method that we've done. We have all of our workflows and output devices set up in our Fiery Pro Server, Fiery XF system, and we select one workflow, one output device, and we select what reference profile do we want to use. We make sure we have an accurate output media profile and output calibration file, and that in conjunction with the appropriate reference, and if needed, doing an optimization. And the optimization is printing out a target, measuring it, comparing it back to whatever the color characteristics are specified in the reference profile, and come up with a profile that will, a file actually, that will improve the color even a little more, okay? And that will give us accurate color compared to one of the specifications. Now, a G7 curve fitting in here can help get the grays even a little more accurate. What some of the users have found is that by using the G7 process along with their traditional color-managed method, okay, we're using the color space G7 method, that they get even lower delta E values, even better delta E values, obviously especially in the gray areas, okay, the neutral areas. Our last area of compliance then is G7 Extreme. In a traditional color transform, if we have a 100% red, when it gets converted to, say, Grayscale or ISO-coded or Fogra 52, really any of the specifications, we usually get some combination, rarely ever 100% of magenta and yellow. Often there's also that the tertiary color, the color contaminant, the cyan, and sometimes black. Okay? If you were to use expanded gamut printing, G7 Extreme, then our 100% red could be printed with 100% magenta and 100% yellow. No cyan, no magenta. I do recommend that if you are interested in this, because this is the easiest of the G7 processes to attain, give it a try. The first time we ever did this, I was working with Don Hutchinson out at our ViewTech facility. We were I was kind of helping while he was teaching a G7 class to all the ViewTech guys out in Meredith, New Hampshire. And we did just this. We built a calibration file and just used the G7 curve and saw, oh, look at the neutrals. The neutrals are really good. And all of a sudden somebody said, look at the blues. Oh, my goodness, look at the reds. And also we were so concentrating on the grays, because that's what G7 is all about. And we stepped back and said, well, look at the color all of a sudden we're getting off of this output device. It was really, really something. Okay? So, how can G7 help me? Again, controlling the gray balance, a little review here, faster recalibration, again, of the grays, and the ability to use the entire gamut of the printer. So, nuts and bolts, how is this done? Well, let's take a look in our program. I have my Fiery XF set up right now, and I'm printing to my Epson 7900. I can have any output device I want to do this process. Now, I start by building a traditional calibration file, a traditional EPL file. Nothing special about it. I use the same techniques I use whenever I build a calibration file. I'm trying to get the most color out of my output device. I want to make sure, since my 7900 is an aqueous printer, I want to make sure that I don't have any of the primary ramps coming out wet, that my total ink limit isn't coming out wet, that I've got, a halfway decent ballpark gray balance to begin with. It's far from perfect, but it's at least a ballpark. Traditionally, Icc profiles would take us the rest of the way. Now, any of you that have the color profiler option on your copies of FireEXF, licensed to your FireEXF. Anyone with a Pro server, I don't believe there are Pro servers that don't automatically come with a license for the color profiler option. So anybody with a Pro server, you have the profiler option. Anyone with XF that's added it, when you finish the calibration file, that little window pops up and says, hey, do you want to build a media profile? Traditionally, we would say yes. For the G7 process, you would say no. You don't build a media profile at this moment. Then what you would do is make sure your calibration file, your EPL file, gets copied over into your My Profiles folder. Okay? And by the way, for any of you furiously taking notes, at the end of this, we're going to have a link to 2 documents that we have on help.efi.com that I wrote. One is just the fundamentals of the G7 process that I'm going through. The second is using the Chromix curve tool in order to help build the G7 curves and complete this process. So they are step-by-step, take you right through, holding your hand, exactly what you need to do, so you don't need to worry about taking notes here. But the next step after you have created the EPL is then select it in your output device. And you see I've got World of Fire Webinar 2017, our 3rd webinar, and this is the one on G7. That's what I named it. And look down here. Hopefully you can see this on your monitors, but there is no profile listed. I have not built an Icc profile. Okay? So that's really step 1. Get ready. I've got the system ready now. Next, you will process through that workflow what's called the P2P target. This is the target that Don designed to evaluate the system for gray balance accuracy. It's got the primary and secondary, the cyan, magenta, yellow, black, red, green, blue, 4-color gray, 3-color gray, black only, and then all sorts of gray balance patches. This is printed, and then you need to build your G7 curves. So this is printed with color management off. We have to have color management off because on our output device, I don't have an Icc profile. And in order to perform color management, you always have to have 2 Icc profiles. You have to have the source and the destination. So even if this was a file that had an Icc profile embedded in it, which it does not, then I'd need that media profile. Well, I don't have one. So you need to make sure color management is off. You make sure that your calibration file is selected with no Icc profile and that there's no visual correction loaded. This is where we are going to load our resulting G7 curve, but we haven't built it yet. So, build your calibration file, set up your workflow and output device, print this target with no color management enabled using those files, and then you build the G7 curve. Now, there's a couple of methods of doing this. You will need to have a spectrophotometer, first of all. You can do this process manually, or you could do it in a more automated way, which I'll show you using the curve tool. But to do this in the manual way, you need your handheld spectrophotometer, something like an ES2000, and you need graph paper and colored pencils. And if you go to the ID Alliance website, into the G7 section, there's a document that you can procure that takes you through how to do this manually. You measure your ramps and you plot them on graph paper. And then it takes a little bit of math, but you do some calculations and you come up with the curves that you need to create. And once you come up with the curves, you would launch Color Tools. And once Color Tools launched, you need to build this visual correction file. So you would go into visual correction, and remember, everybody has visual correction, so even if you don't have the profiler option, and then you would simply add the various levels for cyan. So you go, okay, my cyan, my 10%, according to my calculations, is supposed to be 12%, and you just go through and you build this curve, and then you click OK, and you would save the curve. Okay? And that nothing but a little bit of time, because all you need to do is have that graph paper and a set of colored pencils and probably a calculator to build the curves. If you're doing this often, you may want to invest in something like the Curve software from Chromix. Now, originally the Curve software was branded under the Ideal Alliance banner, but they have since gotten out of that area of the business, and Chromix has teamed up with Don Hutchinson to create the Curve tool. Curve 3 and Curve 4 have been designed to actually export a G7 curve for use in Fiery Pro servers and FireEXF. And Steve Upton from Chromix and Don Hutchinson got together to design this tool. And it's very easy to use. You start by clicking New. I'm on the Calibrate setting. And then you can come in here and you can fill in all the blanks. And I'll say, okay, this is EFI, and the operator is John Nate, and my output device is my 7900, et cetera, and you just fill in whatever blank. So that's just kind of record keeping. Okay. Then in Curve 4, you can measure the target directly into the software. That's any of you that are still on Curve 3. One of the great benefits I feel of going to Curve 4 is that you can actually connect your spectrophotometer to your system and measure directly into the Curve tool. Prior to Curve 4, in Curve 3, you would need to have a program, something like Old Profile Maker or I1 Profiler. Now, the beauty of that is if you have an ES1000 or ES2000 or an I1 Pro or an I1 Pro 2, with those two programs, you are able to measure a target and save the data file without having a license for that software program. So you can go to the X-Rite website and download the software. And again, if you have the I1 Pro, ES1000, ES2000, you can measure the curves, save it as a CGAT text file, and then you can bring that file into Curve 3 or Curve 4. If you have Curve 4, you can measure right into it. Okay. Now that's what I did. I actually did that. I measured it in and then I saved it as a standalone file, but I'll show you how this works. So you then select, okay, here's my calibration run. And what I did is I have my file that I measured from that P2P target saved, and I'm just going to drag it right here into this window. And it plots the curves. Now, what we're looking at here is, again, first of all, this is kind of looking at our tonality. My green is the G7 ideal. Now, where in the world did that come from? Well, in my preferences, I can select what I'm trying to conform to. Am I trying to hit Grayscale or swap? I can load other profiles for FOGRA, for ISO, for Japan color, and it will plot that neutral, print neutral density curve. And you can see my red curve is what I have right now, and on average, I am very, very low. And that's what my output looked like. My output looked very light. So I knew, hey, it's got to be darker. Traditionally, that would have been done with Icc profiles. Now, the lower area here, this is the gray. And these are the A and B curves. And the middle line, 0, would be dead neutral. And you can see that they are not. Certainly when we get up into the higher levels, we are just not neutral. The TBI curves and these other curves, these are traditionally used more in the offset printing process. But we're looking here, and yeah, we're really not looking very good. And if I go to Analyze, you can see that my tolerance here for average delta E is supposed to be 1.5, and for my weighted delta L star, and this is my weighted gray balance. Boy, I'm at 10. My maximum is almost 19, and the tolerance is 3. So, yeah, I'm a little out of gray balance at this moment in time with just my calibration file. Now, remember, we also have targeted and color space. The Curve 4 tool is used for offset printing. Any of the, I should say, not any, but many of the guys doing the G7 process use the Curve tool, and this is how they analyze the results. You know, are they hitting the targeted compliance levels for Fogra, ID Alliance, etc., or the color space. We are really concerned right here at the moment with just the grayscale because, again, we don't have the colorants. We don't necessarily have the media. So what I need to do then is, again, I'm looking at my curves. I'm looking at what I have. I've got a lot of things I can look at here, but I need to go to my Create Curves area. And my Create Curves area has a couple of additional areas. And this is all covered in the documentation, both the documentation that's listed at the end of the webinar, or if you have the curve tool or one of the other tools that you use for building G7 curves that are available on the market, the manual, the reference manuals. But you can modify settings here. Gray balance is probably one of the more important. If I take a look back at my measurements, and again, covered in the documentation, but depending upon how close these endpoints are to 0, then I can move this farther up. And what this is doing is, traditionally, we feather off the gray balance correction as we move up into the higher density tonal regions. Okay, a couple of reasons, saving ink, etc. But also in the darker tonal areas, you're less likely to notice that there is a non-neutral area. I mean, you look at absolute jet black, and you can measure it, and it can be pretty far off in LAB color space, well, in AB color space, and to most people, human eye, it still looks black. Okay, so we can actually feather that off, or we can try to do a good gray balance all the way through. Now, Don found that although our traditional 10% steps can often work, it's recommended to add additional steps. So I'm going to click the little plus sign, and I'm going to add a 5%, and I'm going to add a 95% anchor point. And here we have automatically our gray balance curves calculated. So I didn't have to do any other work. I just had to enter the points, and the system will do the rest. So this is what the pencils and the graph paper would have done, is this portion. I can then export this as a VCC file, a visual color correction file. This is the file you would have drawn. Okay. We also have Fiery device link profiles. This is for our friends over on the toner side of the Fiery world. But I'm going to export a VCC file and click Export. And notice it goes into the balance folder. This is where all of our correction files go. Again, listed in the documentation. And I'm just going to call this my World of Fiery 2017 number 3 G7. That's what it, whoops, G and G7. There we are, G7 curve. And save that. So that is my curve. I could then reprint and bring it in, and I could do a verification and see how close I came. Sometimes you have to maybe do a little tweak to the curves, but what we have actually done then is simply built this G7 curve. Now, under visual correction, that curve will be available. Maybe not right away. Sometimes it takes a minute or two for it to show up, but there is my World of Fiery G7 curve. By selecting that with no profile, I am now G7 Extreme. That's all I need to do. And if I want, I can go to my System Manager, and with my output device, I can select World of Fiery, my G7 curve, and I am now running the system full gamut. I'm taking advantage of all my ink that's available, all my color that's available, and my grays are nice and neutral. Now, the one downside of G7 Extreme is repeatability. Because the capability of the output device may shift over time, and we're running at full blast, if the maximum ink levels drop a bit, and I can't get them back by redoing a calibration curve, well, then I can't quite get back to that same point. But the fact that my G7 Extreme that I'm printing today doesn't match something that I printed for the same customer maybe a year ago, but it still has a whole lot of color, likely is not that big of an issue, we would hope. Okay, we would like to be repeatable, but sometimes we just can't. By the way, I've loaded that G7 curve that I created on a curve tool, and this is the curve that's actually been created. You'll notice it bumped up everything. Actually, black came down a little bit. So my black curve was running a little heavy, but all the other curves are running very, very light, and they have now been repaired. And notice there's my 5% and my 95% automatically in there. Okay, so I can even go back into my color tools and nudge these curves if I want to for maybe a visual appearance. Now, G7 Extreme, G7 Expanded, currently how it's configured will work fine as long as I'm processing CMYK files. Remember, I do not have a media Icc profile. Okay, so if I don't have a media Icc profile, then I can't process RGB or LAB files. So I can't process spot colors. I can't process RGB files that come in. So what I need to do if I want to process those types of files is I do need to create a media profile. So I would simply select Create Media Profile in my Color Tools program. And as soon as the program launches, then I would give it a name. And once the name, running a little slow here, apologize. But once I give it a name, there we go, and I will just give it a quick name. I would select my output device, and under Next, I would select my G7 calibration file. With my G7 calibration file selected, click Next, and continue to build a traditional Icc profile the way you've always done it. Again, that's the beauty of this. There's nothing special about building the EPL. There's nothing special about building the Icc profile. You just carry on the way you always have. But once you build the Icc profile, then it will be linked to your calibration file. And let me get this out of the way at the moment. And I've already taken the liberty to create that. And then I saved it as a new media name so that I can load it here. And now you see I do have my Icc profile listed. There's my World of Fire Webinar 2017-3 G7 Icc profile. Okay, that's step one. Step two of the expanded gamut is to go to the workflow. You need to go to your My Profiles folder and select that Icc profile and copy it and paste it into the Reference Profiles folder so that on the color management pane you can select under your CMYK reference that profile. What's happening now is any CMYK file that comes in will be assigned the full gamut profile. This is the profile of the entire gamut of the output device. It's your media profile. These files will then be converted from that profile to the media Icc profile, which is the same profile. Now, yes, in the purest form, there is a subtle little change that takes place, but we're still running full gamut. No, we're still using the entire gamut of the output device. RGB files will be converted directly to our full gamut output profile, and LAB values, our spot colors, will take advantage of the entire gamut of the output device. There's no limiting at all. So now we've kind of have the best of all worlds. We can have expanded gamut and use the entire gamut of the output device for CMYK, RGB, and spot colors. If you simply want to conform to a specification, then instead of selecting your World of Fire webinar, by the way, this would also be set the simulation profile for none at the moment. But you could also select anything else. I could select ISO uncoded. And now I'm doing ISO uncoded with on top of a gray balanced system. And if my system drifts and my grays are no longer neutral, the beauty of this is all I need to do is turn color management off, reprint this target with no visual correction. So kind of back to only my calibration file. Print this, measure it, build a new G7 curve, drop it in, and you're back to where you were. And especially if you have something like the curve tool, you are spending maybe 15 minutes on this. It is a very, very, very fast process. Okay? Our recalibration process, and we also have the optimization process. And if you're really a stickler for color, we usually recommend using the optimization process, which is printing a much larger target and usually several of them. So if you think that your customers are happy with gray balanced images and aren't necessarily demanding, well, it has to conform to Grackle. You know, the brochure on the table at the trade show has to look exactly like the trade show booth image that's, 5 feet behind it that pretty much nobody other than the art director who comes to take a look at the booth is going to notice. You could be better off doing the backdrop G7 Extreme, because let's face it, what's the purpose of the backdrop? To catch someone's eye, to catch their attention. And that's why we use color in the first place. Color grabs attention. Okay? The advertising world discovered that long, long, long ago. So I do recommend investigating the G7 Extreme process and try it. Again, if you want to see how it works for you, you don't have to spend much money. You can go to the ID Alliance website and download the documentation. Some of it is available for purchase, the how-to guides that tell you exactly step-by-step how to do this manually, and give it a shot. Now, if you want to learn more, and hey, who of us wouldn't want to learn more? There is the G7 certification process. And there are 2 levels of G7 certification. First, there is professional. A G7 professional is someone who works at a company that prints conforming to the G7 process, understands the G7 process, understands it for proofing and printing using their own in-house equipment. You need to have a G7 expert on site conducting what's called a review, teaching you how to do this process, making sure you understand the process. You actually print out some samples then, and the samples are submitted to the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York for verification that, yes, you actually are conforming to whatever you say you're conforming to. And you select, it's G7 targeted for SWAP 3. Then that's what they will take a look at. Certification is valid for 2 years, and either you or your company has to be members of the ID Alliance. Now, the next step up is G7 Expert. Those of us that are G7 Experts, we attended a class. It can be the same class as the professional. There's a written exam. We have to score higher on the written exam than the professionals have to. But we are taught all this. We cover color management maybe in a little more depth, a little more of the fundamentals. But again, it's valid for 2 years. But now, as experts, we can go in and train someone at a company and deem them professionals. Okay? We can do the training. They take the test. They go through the process, but one-on-one with us. So the ID Alliance only can certify experts. The ID Alliance or experts can certify professionals. So I hope I've piqued your interest, your curiosity in the G7 process with our wide format output devices and how it can help. Again, we learned now what the G7 process is, what it does, that it's not an end to itself. It's how to get to where you're going. The value of using it, especially for the expanded gamut or the really quick recalibration of Grayscale, lower delta E's, full gamut output, and you've seen the steps. It's very, very simple. Build a calibration file, build the G7 curve, drop it in. If you need to, build an Icc media profile, and possibly copy and paste that into the reference profiles folder and select it. It's really, really very, very straightforward, and especially after you do it a couple of times. And you've learned a little bit about the G7 certification options. Again, if you're interested in that, you can go to the ID Alliance website. And with that, we have additional session resources, and I'll turn it back to, well, I can't remember. Is it going to Yal or
Ellie? Yes.
Ellie,
Hi.
you're on.
Yes, thank you, John. That was a very interesting explanation. We do have some session resources, which you already mentioned, on help.efi.com. We have the G7 and FireXF how-to guide, which gives a more general overview, but then also the implementing a G7 curve in Fiery Pro Server and FireXF using Chromix Curve 4 tool. So all of what John explained today is step-by-step explained in that, so you can definitely run through that at your own time. And then we also have a link to the video of Don Hutchinson if you would have missed it in our invite. And we have a link to the ID Alliance website where you can find the G7 specifications, but more importantly, also some very good white papers that give you more background information. This is the last webinar for 2017, but we do have all of our recorded webinars available on our website. All the webinars that we've done so far are there. If there's any topics you would like to see or rejoin, you can definitely go to the website, see the video, download the presentation, and also download or go to all of the session resources we shared for every session. Then we did our webinars this year, but for 2018 we will be planning our webinars as well shortly. The webinars always become available in the EFI webinar calendar the moment they were scheduled, and we've got an exact date for them. If you have any specific topics you would like to see covered in our webinar series for next year, please fill out or have your say form and send us your ideas. And with that, I think we should be ready for questions.
That's right. So let's give Ellie and John a minute or two to review the questions that we've already received. But to our audience, if you have questions for John or Ellie, this is the perfect time to include those in either the chat or QA window. We have about 7-8 minutes to go through questions today, and if we didn't get to yours, we'll certainly get back to you directly and also provide the FAQ document, which will have all the questions and answers. So with that, let's get going. Ellie, take a look at what we had.
So here's the first question for you, John. Where does G7 compliance fall into for fiery toner-based printers?
Well, again, for fiery toner-based, the G7 process is the G7 process. It's working, it's gray balance. The G7 process is meant to do gray balance and to help you conform to some of the specifications. Now, the toner side is working a little different. The new calibrator that is on the toner side actually allows you to do a G7-based calibration. It kind of has the P2P target built in so that you can build a G7-based calibration rather than kind of gluing a G7 calibration on top of our calibration on the inkjet side. We hope coming soon, sometime next year, to actually be able to do that on the inkjet side also, because our engineers in Germany have said that on the inkjet side, yeah, it would be best to actually do a G7-based calibration from scratch. So it's a little more straightforward on the toner side. I believe that's the new calibrator that's coming out fairly soon if it's not already shipped. I apologize, the toner side of the world I'm not as familiar with as my inkjet side. But really, same concept, same process, same idea.
So the next one, for most accurate output after time, is it better to recreate the G7 curves with a new VCC file, or is it better to re-linearize with a new EPL file?
The answer, and I think I've said this on every webinar I've ever done, there's a great answer to everything regarding color on your systems, and the answer is to every question, that depends. My recommendation is, if you possibly can, is to use something, a verification tool, a color verifier in XF or one of the standalone tools that some of you might use to see where the issue is. If you're trying to conform to a specification, you should be able to see on the verification results what the problem is. If it's a gray balance, well, then it's going to be very, very quick maybe to just redo your gray correction using the G7 curve. If you find that the, for instance, the 100% yellow patch is off, and it's off in L-star, well, yeah, I'm not sure. Then you might need to rebuild the Icc profile. Kind of the order, I would say, is because the G7 curve is so fast, see if you can do that first, just to get the grays back in balance. The second would be to build a new Icc profile using the existing calibration file. That's the fastest because you're printing and measuring one target. And then if all else fails and something's really screwed up, it might be that the repair guy was in and swapped out heads, then you might have to start over from scratch. But certainly if you're just looking at, my neutrals don't quite look neutral anymore, bang, no question, just do a G7 curve.
Okay, so then a few more around if there are any plans to include G7 calibration option into the XF color tools. Now,
yes,
I did check. Yes, I did check with product management on that. So there are indeed plans. Like what you already showed, John, is that a big part can be done in XF already, and then you can or go for the manual method or the Curve 4 tool, and then go back into XF. Replacing that step that is or manual or using the Curve 4 tool is something that is planned, but we never can commit to a real-time scale. So definitely we know about it, we understand that it's important, and feel free to keep bugging us, I would say.
Yeah, the next release, we have a huge release of XF coming, version 7, coming next year, where it will operate under Command Workstation, where EFI truly is becoming, kind of one EFI, one RIP, and the same interface for the most part driving any of the output devices, whether it's a Reggiani, a ViewTech, one of the smaller inkjets, or a toner system, and that's a huge leap for us. And G7 implementation is kind of coming after that. So it will not be in the first release of 7, but personally I'm hoping sometime in the early 7-something releases we'll have true G7 calibration built in. Can't promise, but hope springs eternal.
Okay. Here is another one. How often do I need to recreate G7 curves?
Again, you have two options. The one would be to check with use some type of a verification tool in a spectrophotometer to see if your gray balance is starting to go out of whack. The other would be, recommend this to everybody if you don't have spectrophotometers in the verification process, to print out a set of sample images. And here you'd want to make sure especially that you've got some grayscale images, some 1, 4-color, 3-color grayscales, gray images in this test file. Print it out when you know your system is running well. Throw it in a drawer where it's out of any kind of direct light, away from chemical vapors, so that hopefully it doesn't change or fade. And then every once in a while reprint it and bring it out and compare and look at the grays. And when the balance of the grays starts to irritate you, rebuild your G7 curve.
Okay. I also have a couple of questions around links, presentations, downloads of the video. So we will have an email going out to everybody with the link to the presentation where you can download it because it's too large to email. Also a link to the webinar recording so you can watch it again, and links to the resources. And I also got a question asking if we can get the links directly to the documents that are on help.efi.com. We will include those as well. Then a very specific one, we are using 3M inks on our EFI G1625. How would we implement this G7 process?
The G7 process is output device, ink, media, agnostic. It doesn't care whether you're using 3M inks, EFI inks, 2M inks, 1M ink, we don't care. It's the same process. You simply do a traditional calibration and then print the P2P target, build your G7 curve, and drop it in. It absolutely does not care. It will try to make a neutral gray scale of the proper tonality no matter what the output device, no matter what the technology.
All right.
So it doesn't care.
Okay, great. So we're about a minute over the hour. Let's take a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. And as I said, we'll include all the questions in an FAQ document and send that out along with the rest of the resources. Just 2 more, please.
Okay. When you make an EPL file, are you making curves? Sorry, you are making curves.
Yeah, an EPL file effectively is curves. It's when you build an EPL file, you perform a number of tasks. One, you want to make sure you don't over-ink. And over-ink on an aqueous printer means it's coming out wet. But on a non-aqueous, like a UV printer, you want to make sure you're not wasting ink, that, you know, I'm laying down more ink, but I'm not gaining any chroma out of it. You want to make sure that the process of building an EPL also does linear curves, so that you get a linear ramp, which is not the ramp that conforms to the specification or necessarily the ramp that gives you a great gray balance. That's why we only have an okay gray balance when you build the calibration file, because it's trying to get the curves linear, and depending upon the colorants in your inks, that combination may not give you a good gray balance. Likely won't. That's where the G7 comes in. And then totaling, to make sure, again, when you lay down a lot of ink, it doesn't come out wet or you're not wasting ink. So that's what the calibration file does. But the G7 curve on top of that then makes sure that you do get that gray balance.
Okay, and then the last one for today, I have the i1 Pro 2 and the i1 Profiler. Can I use the Curve 3 software in demo mode to calculate and export VCC file?
Unfortunately not. The Curve tool in demo mode only allows you to use the demo files that come with the installer, so it doesn't let you bring in additional, because effectively if you were able to do that, that defeats the purpose of buying the Curve tool from Chromix. So oddly enough, they don't allow you to do that. So if you want to play around with the Curve tool, you can download it, but if you launch it and you aren't licensed, it's in demo mode only, and you can just see how the interface works, but you aren't able to bring in outside files or save final files.
Great. So yeah, so we had a few more questions about Curve and how to get all the information will be included on our resources page. So one page will send you a link to which will have a copy of the presentation, a link to the recording, the FAQ document, and all the other resources we talked about. So you'll have just one place to go to get everything. So look for that in a few days as we work to kind of put it all together for you. So with that, we really appreciate everybody's time joining us today. Hope you took a lot of great information out of this and are anxious to try it out yourself. And of course, thank you to Ellie and John, who did a great job presenting this information, as always. And so until next time, we look forward to seeing you then, and in the meantime, please do take advantage of our recorded sessions from the last couple of years. See you then. Take care.